Hello and welcome to the programme which brings together columnists from UK newspapers with the foreign correspondents who write, blog and broadcast to audiences in their home country from the Dateline London. This was the week when Sue Gray delivered her report into whether Downing Street partied during the COVID lockdowns. Did the Gray report itself deliver? We learnt the likely impact of surging energy prices, a doubling of the numbers in fuel poverty in the UK. The government's answer to it? Throw money at the problem. Is it proportionate or inflationary? And what about those other sharply rising bills? Is inflation stalking the globe? To discuss all that in the studio are the American journalist Stephanie Baker, who's senior writer with Bloomberg Markets, Steve Richards, a political commentator who presents the podcast Rock and Roll Politics, and Ian Martin, who founded and edits the news website Reaction and is a columnist for The Times. Lovely to have you all with us. Thank you very much. Let's plunge straight in. Ian Martin, at the end of a week, much predicted, much debated. Yeah. Where is the Prime Minister's position now, do you think?
Well, on one level, he's survived. There was all this hype about Sue Gray, who's an official inside the government, conducting a report into these parties, which people have heard about. And in the end, the report really not exonerated him, but kind of let him off the hook. And it's a classic Boris situation where he just sort of delays, creates confusion. We all sort of felt we knew what was in the report by the end. Her conclusion was fairly bland, and he's free again. So in that sense, he's survived what was supposed to be a week that, if you'd said this gone back about a month ago, you'd said, well, it might bring him down. But he just gets away with it again, which Boris Johnson always seems to have a knack of doing. I think underneath the surface, it's more complex than that, and you can feel big shifts in British politics going on. I think personally that you can start to see a beginning of not a settled consensus, but just people starting to say to each other in and around Whitehall, in the media in the UK, there is a Labour government coming, because even though it hasn't finished off Boris Johnson, it has trashed the Tory brand and trashed his personal brand, and I think it's going to be very, very difficult for him to recover longer term, and he may attempt to fight the next general election. But Boris, remember, as a personality, I used to work with him years ago on the Telegraph. Boris thinks always very much in terms of just getting through the next day and getting out of particular scrapes. So at the end of this week, he'll be pretty pleased that he's survived.
Steve Richards, should he be?
Well, in my view, no. But my view, frankly, is uninteresting and irrelevant.
I don't know. We've invited you on because we'd like to hear your view.
Well, my view on him is it's obvious. You know, he made the rules, broke the rules, and then, in the view of many, lied about doing so. But the more interesting question, I think, is why has he survived, given that? And it is worth remembering that British Prime Ministers rarely offer their own resignation. Harold Wilson did it, and no one else in modern times. And therefore, I think it is wholly unsurprising that he's still there. Prime Ministers, when they're in deep trouble, reach the conclusion that it's in the national interest that they carry on. And he has reached that
The question
conclusion.
is then why those who are in a position not to share that view have not, as they have done before, acted,
well,
even though they are apparently expressing their view.
That is the other interesting question. And of course, they have done it before with Margaret Thatcher. She had won 3 elections by then and had ruled for 11 years. This is just 2.5 years after he won them a huge majority. So again, I think it's unsurprising at this point that Tory MPs haven't moved to topple him. And this is a weird Conservative parliamentary party. Lots of people are there new to national politics, and it's a very big thing to topple a Prime Minister. So I'm not surprised he's still there. I don't think it's this, oh, he's a genius at getting out of holes. He follows a pattern very familiar in British politics. That doesn't mean Tory MPs might still move against him, because in my view, trivial though that element of it is, what he's done is so transparently appalling. Voters will notice, and that might lead to things, but let's see.
Move on to that question.
The Tory tribe is divided, really. I mean, it doesn't quite know what to do. The reason he's there, and the reason MPs haven't moved against him in sufficient numbers, is they're not sure who would replace him. A few months ago, that might have been Rishi Sunak, but Rishi Sunak's taken a huge knock in the last couple of months and faces enormous economic problems. So who really wants to take over? There are potential successors. but not an obvious front runner. So they're watching and waiting. There's a part of the Tory tribe that believes that ultimately he's a winner, and that Boris in the past has always kind of got away with it, and that somehow come through all these problems. So don't remove someone who has extraordinary charisma and has proved himself a winner in the mayoralty, won Brexit, won a stonking majority in 2019, so give him one last go. I think that approach is kind of misguided, because I think the view that's settling in with voters of distrust, I think is so serious that ultimately I think it's going to be very hard for him to bounce back and win the next election.
Can I offer, and as ever, polls are a snapshot of opinion at a particular time, but the FT published some figures after the Sucre report, and they suggest in a Savanta Comrades survey 65% of voters think Boris Johnson should resign, and this is all voters, so regardless of which party they normally support. 76% thought the Prime Minister had misled Parliament. With figures like that, if they are a snapshot of a passing mood, it might not matter. But if they're a snapshot of a shift, Stephanie Baker, in terms of perceptions of the Prime Minister, then they really ought to worry his party.
Yeah, the thing that surprised me is that you didn't have more Tory MPs standing up in Parliament criticising him, given what we all know is the public mood on this. You had some MPs come out afterwards and make these statements and criticize him, but using the floor of the House of Commons, they seem too shy to do. And I think the real test will come when this parliamentary committee convenes.
This is the Privileges Committee that will look at whether he may have misled Parliament.
Right. To determine whether or not he deliberately and willfully misled and lied to Parliament. And, he'll have to testify in front of that committee and,
But it kicks the can down the road again.
And we don't know how long that will take. That could take a very long time to come to a conclusion, but he will probably try to wiggle his way out of it. And like usual, just sort of parse his words and fudge it and hope that by the time it comes around, people will have forgotten.
What about the culture of government? Because I was interested by something that a very junior figure in British politics, Paul Holmes, said when he gave up his unpaid ministerial advisory role on Friday. He said he thought a deep mistrust in both the government and the Conservatives happened. He talked about a toxic culture that seemed to have become active in Downing Street, and he worried about that long term. And I wonder whether this report, for example, the criticism of civil servants is arguably as significant as it is of politicians in the Sucre report, whether there's a sense that probably this has damaged not just an individual or a party, but it's damaged the practice of government.
Well, it has, but I think that's a reality about the British system. Essentially, it tends to reflect the personality of whoever is Prime Minister. And Boris is, let's face it, a fairly shambolic figure. And I think what the Grey report revealed is that ultimately a lot of those officials, they might quite like Boris in a sort of chummy way in the office, but they don't fear him. So it's impossible to imagine that culture or that behaviour under, say, Margaret Thatcher or Gordon Brown or Theresa May or anyone since the war. Goodness, Churchill drank during the war, but the staff in Number 10 really respected him and felt that they were doing something important.
So my colleagues wrote an interesting story this week about, given the excruciating detail of drunken parties going on late into the night, maybe there should be a ban on drinking within Downing Street. And a source said that Boris Johnson dismissed that idea, saying Britain never would have gotten through World War II without drink to take off the strain. So, what I find very disturbing is this is just part of a broader pattern, right? An alarming number of Tory MPs have run foul of the law, and I think it's a real sign of a party that's been in power for too long. This is supposed to be the party of law and order, and this is what we get.
But that culture that I described means that you don't necessarily have, and this sounds hysterical, but Britain doesn't really have a functioning government at the moment, by which I mean the system only really works when the person at the top knows exactly what they're doing, can transact business, can command respect and authority internally. It flows through the system.
Peter Lord Hennessy, this is the kind of man who's written so much about the operation of government. He's a journalist and academic, and also the man who helped expose the fact we even had a ministerial code of conduct. Said in an article last week he thought was a sort of the good chap version of British government, that it works provided the person in charge is a good chap or a good chap-ess, a good woman. They have the right values. Otherwise, it can be distorted by anyone who has the authority to do it. In other words, there are not enough checks and balances.
And Boris Johnson, because of that majority, and because the election is relatively close, still has quite a lot of authority. There was, to go back a bit, there was an attempt to get rid of Harold Wilson in 1968-69 when he had won an even bigger majority. And we would have been sitting here thinking...
Is that, I know what's going on, I'm going on.
You know what's going on, I'm going on. And we'd have been talking here about whether he could survive. He survived for another 8 years. So they tend to survive. But what makes this interesting is there are lots of moving parts. So you have number 10, which is both a neurotic, paranoid place, but also very cocooned. You go back after that grey day and think, oh yeah, we've done it, you know, and all the team will say, we've got through it. But then you have Tory MPs going back to their constituencies at a weekend, speaking to constituents, party workers. That might provide them with quite a sort of cold reality. And you have, I think one of us, Stephanie mentioned the Privileges Committee report coming up. There are
two important
by-elections. So there are lots of moving parts, which I'm sure number 10 will brief the Sunday papers, yeah, we're through it and all the rest of it. And then we've got the economic crisis.
Yes,
I know we're coming on to it, but it is fascinating that propelled this self-proclaimed fiscal conservative chancellor leftwards. And so that's another fascinating ingredient, which makes it all incredibly hard to read, frankly, as to what's going to happen.
Is the consensus that when we sit here in a month's time, it could look the same or it could look very different?
I've given up making predictions when it comes to Boris Johnson. The other factor, of course, is Ukraine.
Yes.
I mean, that's really the biggest factor, in that, if I was to defend Boris Johnson, not something I've done very often recently, his response and the UK response in alliance with the US and Canada has been, if not exemplary, then pretty close to it in terms of standing up for Ukraine, warning, arming the Ukrainians. So a defender of Boris Johnson would say, well, what about Ukraine, where he's leading well, and it's a middle of a war, a geopolitical situation which he and his advisors have called broadly correctly.
Yes.
So that's a big factor.
But does the British population care about that? I mean, where he has, I agree, done an exemplary job in terms of leading British response to the war in Ukraine, but isn't the salient issue cost of living and
people vote on
the
foreign
NHS, which is, on
Ukraine is not going to decide the result of the next general election.
Good. Let's talk about the economy then. You both referred to Rishi Sunak. Ian, you said his reputation isn't what it was. He might have hoped to salve it a bit with the announcement this week, and it's certainly an important announcement for everybody in the UK who's been worried about the massive increase in energy bills and the general rising cost of living. What do you make of that announcement and the implications of it? Because even on the Conservative side, there seems to be a bit of, we're grateful for the money, but we don't like being the party that's doing this kind of thing, throwing money at a problem.
The response is fascinating because it's split the Tories down the middle with what you might call the kind of one nation wing, and actually the sort of Boris Red Waller wing as well, liking the fact that the government is throwing money at the problem. I mean, I think ultimately those on the other side, the sort of free market Thatcherites who are saying this is a ridiculous splurge, I think they're missing the point. The scale of what's about to be felt by the poorest in this country, not a situation which is unique to Britain, but just the scale of what's coming merits some kind of response. Also on the windfall tax question, well, Margaret Thatcher did windfall taxes in 1981 and 1982 in the depths of the recession, then when people were hurting. So I think that there's a logic to it, but the party is kind of rootless now and doesn't quite know how to respond.
Hence perhaps the schizophrenic response from the government, which was just a few weeks ago. Windfall tax, disastrous idea, terrible idea, unconservative, we won't do it.
Never going to happen.
And now we're doing it, or give it a different name, but effectively, in essence, that is what it is.
Yeah, but it is a slightly chaotic approach to the problem, and as you say, that's the other problem with the party's business. They've been very preoccupied with that.
Is that
and
the
the war in
danger of this,
Ukraine?
that it's followership rather than leadership? That in a series of places you've got one things in the vote on, for example, whether or not there should be, your neighbour should be changing their house next door to you. The idea, well, this is a good idea because it's too complicated for us to do it, it's too controversial for us to do it. So that sense of, if there's enough public anger about something, policy will follow that.
I think it's deeper than that. You see, you have in Rishi Sunak, as I said earlier, this self-proclaimed fiscal conservative, and his spring statement a few weeks ago, which was a sort of minimalist approach to the economic crisis, was him. Boris Johnson was weak. He couldn't be this sort of call me a Rooseveltian, spend, and Sunak didn't. And within weeks, he's had to come back with a big package, which has been acknowledged by the Institute for Fiscal Studies as being pretty redistributive, targeting poorer incomes, and spending a lot of money. And it seems to me a reverse of the 1970s, where you had the then Prime Minister Jim Callaghan saying you can't spend your way out of a recession, Margaret Thatcher leaping on it, and the tidal waves were moving rightwards in her direction. It seems to me,
so
when
even the party that would have normally argued differently was arguing the same.
Yeah. Now, whether Labour are supple enough to seize that moment is one of the big questions in the coming year or so. But that moment is here is fascinating, I think.
Can we talk about the economics of it? Because I wonder, Stephanie, when you sit writing Bloomberg Markets, you look at the broader picture on these things rather than from a domestic political perspective. What are the markets making of the judgment the Chancellor's made? What are other policymakers faced with similar problems? How are they reacting to exactly the same, well, not the same problems, but very similar problems? Inflation seems to be stalking the globe.
Right. So, I mean, I think there's a feeling that if he hadn't acted, the risk of a recession would have been higher because you're taking so much money out of the economy because those people wouldn't be able to spend money on other things. Yeah. So, broadly speaking, we're in this, big debate right now. Are we heading for stagflation a la the 1970s?
Which is where you get little growth but high inflation. High
inflation and low growth. Or are we heading for a recession? And I think it's too early to say. I think the outcome of the war in Ukraine and how central banks respond will have a bearing on that. But one of the hallmarks of stagflation in the 70s was high unemployment, which we don't have right now. So that's a positive.
We don't have it in the UK, and they don't have it in the United States.
Exactly.
The Federal Reserve in the US saying we're trying to basically hit a swift spot where we put up interest rates to curb inflation, but we don't drive out businesses and therefore start to see joblessness go up.
Right, and so I think some economists are looking at it saying, inflation is already having a cooling effect on the economy in some respects, and so maybe inflation has peaked, but it's very hard to tell how it's going to play out. And I think globally, the big question mark is what happens with China. The Chinese economy is slowing down in a way that we haven't seen for years. Bloomberg has actually projected that China's economy will grow by only 2% this year, and that the U.S. would actually outpace Chinese growth for the first time since the mid-1970s. So that just turns the whole global economy on its head. We haven't been here before. The global, we've all counted on China as the world economy's savior, and it's facing some really tough challenges. A big one is the demographic challenges, right? Which is a result of their one-child policy, which of course they reversed, but you still have
these... It's going to take years before that...
But you still have falling birth rates. And then you have a broader structural change, which is China shifting from coal to gas, which is going to keep energy prices high. So that whole prediction of, China's going to overtake the U.S. as the world's largest economy, I think that's looking very uncertain right now. And I think we are probably in a period of volatile inflation. And if you look at the 1970s, inflation jumped up and down quite a bit over a number of years. So even if it comes down in the next few months, it could pop up again fairly soon. And I think for the UK and for Rishi Sunak, what I would expect is in 6 months' time, he may have to come back and spend more money.
I think he will. The interesting thing now about the UK economy is that there is a labour shortage. So in the early 80s, Margaret Thatcher could use high unemployment as a way of controlling inflation. People were desperate to go into jobs and would take low-paid jobs to just get back in. That mechanism is not available now. It's the opposite. They need to get people into jobs, which
particularly to drive the kind of economy that people hope will emerge from this, and the kind of economy that might make the UK more resilient to some of these international pressures. I mean, that's a huge dilemma for policy.
You might find some of the people who opted out of the labour market during COVID coming back in, so that might resolve itself.
Do you think they will?
They might do. This has been a feature of the COVID economy, is that people just stopped driving things like cabs and opted out of the economy. They might start to come back in. But I think you're absolutely right when you make the China point, because it's not just that there's this huge shift happening with the war in Ukraine, which undoes the global order. We've also got, we're at the end of, it's essentially a sort of 25-year process or model of how Western economies run.
Just crudely the globalisation.
Going from globalisation to deglobalisation. And they are connected to the Ukrainian thing. So you'll start to see countries that are allies sticking together, siloed, shorter supply, lines of supply, greater emphasis on
trade
energy
closer
security,
at home because you've got more security.
Now that disruption, and plus inflation, which is something which, I remember going to hear Alan Greenspan lecture, nearly 20 years ago, and we lived in that period with the end of inflation. It was just something that had been banished. A method had been found where the economy was never too hot, never too cold, and that was just the reality we live with. That's now over.
I will do one sentence only, I promise you.
No, we've got a little bit of time.
Trade with closer at home?
Yes.
I'm just going to mention it once. I know it's not, and Ian disagrees. Brexit is another factor that the British economy, it was going to be a seismic shift. Everyone acknowledges it was going to be a big, big shift. And that is another factor. I mean, we have opted not to maintain trade with people closer at home in the same way. And I think that is another factor that you might disagree with the shortages in the labour market.
And to be fair, some Brexiteers were quite candid about this at the time, saying, look, there will be changes. We're in a period of transition. We think there is a sunnier upland ahead, but we don't know quite how we can chart the next bit. But this is an added complication, I guess, what's happening everywhere else to that.
I think it's
how that path looked 6 years ago.
It's ridiculous. It would be ridiculous if Brexiteers, but some Brexiteers do, to not admit that it's created difficulties. It's essentially creating trade barriers. For me, it was never really about that. For me, it was about kind of democratic fundamentals and greater autonomy.
Yep.
I would say it's balanced. I'd say there's an economic issue, obviously, and the deal needs to be improved. But if you look at two disasters that have happened since Brexit, in both of them, COVID with vaccines, and I wouldn't wish to overstate this, but also with Ukraine, you see evidence there of the benefits of greater national autonomy.
A bit more national self-interest.
If it's a state of mind in a way of kind of pursuing, geopolitics.
Before I let Stu back in, the issue then is, as an island, if we are seeing this deglobalisation, how best do we cope with that? Because islands are inevitably dependent for getting things, people, skills, whatever, from outside.
Well, I would predict that at some point in the next 5 to 10 years, the deal is going to need re-examining. Britain's going to have to try and bring down some of those trade barriers. Now, it's very difficult because the Labour Party will be accused if it tries that, and I think they are. It's looking like there's going to be a Labour government at some point in the next few years. If they attempt to do that, they'll be accused of trying to reverse Brexit. But I think the direction of travel is probably back towards some kind of renegotiated deal.
Brief last word, Stephanie, if you would.
What I was going to say is that Rishi Sunak, is under enormous pressure because of this big spending, that he's not a true Tory, that he's not proving that he's a low-tax Tory. I think one of the things that he can do to try to show that he is different from, say, a Labour spending government is to change the tax system in this country so it encourages investment. And he did that, took one step towards doing that with the windfall tax on oil and gas companies. But there's so much more that he can do to change the incentive system in the tax system so that companies are incentivized to invest, because the country's had a terrible problem with low productivity, and that is one of the reasons causing it. So he could be bold and come out with a series of proposals to try to encourage investment.
theme in his autumn budget, I suspect.
One would
Let's see.
hope.
There you go. We heard it here first. Suspicion of a Labour government, an interesting expansion in its budget, and by the way, the end of globalisation on top of everything. What a half hour. That's
We
it
need
from
another half hour.
That's it from Dateline London. We're back same time next week. Goodbye.